That's your intro dance?
Yeah, that's my intro dance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Whining with Witches. I am Brittany, and I have with me again.
Lauren? Yeah.
So today's topic is going to be a little controversial. It's about the racism and otherism in witchcraft. So today's topics, we're going to be talking about how I guess I see my practice as a POC in a very still white space in dealing with witchcraft. And then Lauren's perspective also, because of her travels overseas. And I think it incorporates a really good non American perspective, even though we are both Americans. So that is the caveat. So, the what I want to start off with is like my huge pet peeve. I've mentioned it in a previous podcast, but the term black magic, I hate it. I hate it so much. So, black magic is really just a racially charged term to diminish a lot of POC based, especially African based religions or practices. That's why a lot of times we see hoodoo being represented as like the evil thing in shows and movies and stuff, and it's always like black magic and
Disney.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, Princess and the
Mhm.
Frog comes to mind
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's also something I feel like I obviously recognized before I got into witchcraft, but it wasn't until I got into witchcraft where I realized like, wow, there is a lot of indoctrination happening because I kind of thought that. Like I thought a
Yeah.
lot of that was maybe not evil necessarily, but maybe a little more baneful.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just kind of want to get your perspective and then I'll kind of talk a little bit more from my angle of it.
So I grew up in the Houston area, and a lot of people don't know this, but I think a lot of like New Orleans culture bleeds into Houston. So like it's very standard in Houston to like take a weekend trip to New Orleans. They're kind of close, and people in Houston are used to driving long distances.
Well, that and after Hurricane Katrina, you had a
Yeah,
lot of,
yeah.
New Orleans, like, transplants.
Yeah. So I do remember like growing up and obviously like this very established idea of like mysticism and voodoo and hoodoo within New Orleans.
Mhm.
Um, and it was always kind of like this weird thing you go and see and like, but don't, and my cat's going to interrupt us. Um, Hi, Noli. Um, this thing that you just kind of go do. Thank you. Thank you for your perspective on this conversation.
Very
Um,
well-placed perspective.
yeah, but it was very much like an othering kind of thing.
Mhm.
And this kind of like line of it could be real, so don't be mean. But then also it's kind of a gimmick and just go and like admire what and gonna use kind of like the phrasing as a white person and how it would be interpreted like this black magic kind
Mhm.
of, experience. So yeah.
Yeah, the idea that especially so I've been to New Orleans twice, once as a kid, once as an adult. As a kid, we kinda did all the stuff that the adults let us do, so a lot of it was, like, the architecture, the food, going to, like, flea markets, but they didn't really take us to I mean, they're not gonna take us to any voodoo shops or anything like
Yeah.
that, so and then when I was an adult, it was a very short trip. We basically were there for a tournament all day, so we had time for drinks and eating. Shops
Yeah.
were closed by the time we were done, so I never really got to experience that. But I do know like, one of the big attractions out there is them sort of taking this negative aspect of how people can, consider voodoo whatever, and they sort of marketed it
Yeah.
towards tourists and stuff. And I think that's a really cool, I should say interesting way to combat that.
Yeah.
So they just kind of like play into it and make their money, and I can't be mad at
Yeah,
it.
I can't be mad. I would pay. Like, if I
Yeah,
went to New Orleans, I would be like, "Absolutely, take my money." Like,
exactly.
yeah.
I would too. I mean, it would be cool to have a cool little thing from a voodoo shop, but then it would be awesome to be like, okay, so where's the good stuff? Like,
Yeah,
where are
yeah,
the actual like mystical shops? And
yeah.
to see the two dynamics. So now that I'm kind of into that, I would love to do a trip to New Orleans just for that purpose.
Yeah. I still have never been to New Orleans.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So we
I
have
know.
to add that to the list of
Yeah,
places
I'm an
to
awful Texan, or Houstonian, so yeah, I've never been.
go. Wow.
Yeah.
It's really lovely. I mean, the food, the art, the architecture, the everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
No,
definitely is its own thing.
it's a fascinating city from a historical perspective too, which I love history,
I
so,
know.
you know.
And you love all that spooky ooky shit, so you would
Yeah.
love doing, like, the ghost tours
Yes.
and, the fun fact, like, this is where all specific people died tours.
Yeah.
You would we would have to drag you kicking and screaming from the
Yeah.
city.
Yeah. No, I would love that.
But, so along with, like, racism, I feel like there's also what I call otherism, where it's not necessarily just, like not necessarily based on race or anything like that. I see it a lot in, I think the biggest one I notice is, like, men versus women in witchcraft.
Yeah.
So, like, a lot of times there are books that are obviously very feminine based, which is
Yeah.
why a lot of women get into witchcraft. It's very empowering, but then it kind of pushes the pendulum too far and it becomes more of a like, well, witchcraft is only for women type
Yeah.
thing. So that compounded with the and this is going to be very fun transition for you. So this compounded with the idea of like black magic and the racism forms a very white women space. And
Yeah.
it's very reminiscent of like the white feminism versus just
Yeah.
feminism stuff.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Um, so yeah, and I do think the witchcraft community is going through a transition, which is a great thing. And obviously that's from a perspective of like where I live and like the local witchcraft communities do try
Mhm.
um really consistently to be welcoming and diverse and
Mhm.
um the business owners recognize that they are white women and are very like upfront about making spaces for other people's thoughts and opinions.
Mhm.
So I do think it's slowly changing, which is long overdue. But it was very reminds me a lot of second wave feminism in the beginning,
Yeah.
which is kind of when we started to see that divide be really apparent. Um, but yeah, I think it's an interesting development, and then really what comes to mind is, like, the consumer consumption of witchcraft
Mhm.
being sold towards white women.
Yeah.
So, the very controversial, Sephora selling, sage and crystal kits. Well, obviously, Sephora has a very specific demographic that
Right.
they are marketing to. We're gonna get so many, like, cease and desist letters from all these businesses I've dropped today.
Sephora is
Um,
gonna be like, never mention our names again. You're no
yeah,
longer welcome in this store.
yeah. Um, but yeah, and I think finally people are starting to recognize that, and I hope that people continue to make spaces for other people's voices. Um, in person. The online community, I think, will just always be a hot mess because it's online communities, and I don't participate in those spaces like you do,
Yeah.
and will always stay away from them.
I don't blame you. I have both an in-person and an online like community that I m- majorly hang out with.
Yeah.
This isn't even wine. I just can't even talk today.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
But
we're both drinking water today.
which is why I did not ask what Lauren
Yeah,
was drinking. But there is a very clear divide, but I think that's like the nature of the beast with the internet is that you'll always have these like keyboard warriors that feel empowered to say whatever they want. I do remember I guess it was fairly recently within the last year there's like this huge push to better respect like native
yeah,
practices, especially with the whole issue with like can you use white sage versus not using white sage, and the response I always see is like, well, everything's from the earth so we can use it. I'm like,
yeah.
kind of. But should you is the
Should
question.
you? Should you?
Like,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, tobacco is from the earth, but I still don't smoke cigarettes
Yeah.
because I shouldn't do that. But like, so that there's still like this level of disrespect, I feel like,
Yeah.
or entitlement from a large portion. I shouldn't say a large portion, but a good portion of, at least online, good portion of the witching community that just feels like, they're entitled to whatever it is they want to use. And I think a lot of that has come from the consumerism
Yeah.
because, especially with witchcraft becoming more popular, stores picking things up, they just pick up whatever is popular and
Yeah.
push it to people. And people that are coming in new just decide, well, if they're selling it, it must be okay. And then,
It's
of course,
not
they never like
approved.
to be told they're wrong.
Yeah.
So it creates a lot of like disrespect and
Like
and
Calypso.
I know. I think I think Apollo finally
Yeah.
was.
Both Newly and Calypso have made appearances now.
But yeah, I think it creates like this level of entitlement that ends up being very disrespectful
Yeah.
for, you know, practices that for a long time had to be pushed under the table. We all know our country's history with, the relationship between Native Americans and the white settlers and all of
Yeah.
that. And then the same for hoodoo. So hoodoo is very interesting. I don't know how much you know about it. I don't consider myself like a practitioner, but I've been trying to
Yeah.
learn about it. Hoodoo is technically not a closed practice, but
Yeah.
in the I will say African American spiritual community, it's a hot button topic whether white people should be allowed to do hoodoo or not. Some people are like, it doesn't matter at all. Some people are like, well, maybe they should get a hoodoo practitioner to do a reading for them and decide whether it's good or bad.
Yeah.
And then others are like, no, it should just be closed. You should not do it. And a lot of that stems from, the whole reason hoodoo was created, basically by the slaves, because they were forced to give up their African religions, and it was
Yeah.
their way of incorporating a little bit of that and a little bit of the Christianity that was thrown at them. So, I guess, do you have you seen any of that? I know you're not on online communities, so I was just curious.
So in the very beginning, when I was in online communities, I did see a little bit of it. And then specifically, I know it was probably when it was first like becoming a hot topic kind of issue.
Mhm.
And I very much interpret it as an and I think I view a lot of like magic research this way, especially when you're incorporating practices that are based on like ancestors.
Mhm.
Um, that's something that needs to be considered. Um, Ancestrally, we could go back probably a very long time and there is no overlap. And so it's just not something that I've ever researched because it's not something that I myself would feel comfortable practicing.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I never really went past like, okay, this is not a space that was made for me.
Mhm.
And so I respect people within that space, but it's not something that I myself would ever do.
Right. And
Yeah.
that makes sense. I think there's a lot of practices in hoodoo that I think are really common,
Yeah.
both within hoodoo and just kind of across. Hoodoo kind of falls into just like the folk practices. It's just like one of the many different folk practices that exist. And when you have folk practices, certain similarities just
Yeah.
happen across them. And one of the big ones is ancestral work.
Yeah.
And that's I feel like very common in general.
Yeah.
Um and a lot of times people fall into one of two camps. They either are so nervous about being disrespectful, they don't do anything. And then
Yeah.
there are the other people that are like, well, I can do whatever I want.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because a lot of times people will be like, well, is ancestral work closed practice? And I'm like, everybody has ancestors. I'm not gonna tell you you cannot celebrate your own family. That
Yeah.
makes no sense. Now, how you do it might differ from practice to practice,
Yeah.
and maybe, you shouldn't take from a specific like religion or ritual or something like
Yeah.
that, but in general, it's really funny to find the people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum that just are so worried about like just they're like if I make one misstep, the entire internet will cancel me.
They're not wrong, but
They're
yeah.
not, they're
Yeah.
not. And especially, I don't want to speak for any other minority group, but I feel I've noticed that within the Native Americans and the Black practices, they're fiercely protective of
Yeah.
it, which is while Native American practices are closed, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, the hoodoo is not. Now,
Yeah.
voodoo, that's a whole different story,
Yeah.
but hoodoo is not. So it creates this huge rift between even within the community. There are like the black people that are like, whatever, it's not closed.
Yeah.
People can practice. And then there are the others like, why would you as a non-black person want to practice something created by slaves?
Yeah.
So it creates this very interesting dynamic of trying it's hard to navigate.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess, you kind of have your own moral compass when it comes to that. And like you're saying, you just feel like you don't belong in that space. So
Yeah.
I know, I guess I should give my opinion on it. I kind of feel the same way. I'm like, I
Yeah.
kind of side eye people that are not my color practicing hoodoo. And I actually ran across somebody like this the other day. And we were just talking about hoodoo. Someone had asked, and I was like, well, I side eye white people that
Yeah.
practice hoodoo. I generally just don't understand why they would want to participate in a practice that was created because of them.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And she got so offended. She was like, "This is why I don't tell people about my practice." And I was like, "Okay, don't tell people about your practice."
Like, but if you can't say it, if you like, so that statement alone, like, oh, this is why I don't tell people, then maybe you should address why they're telling you that. Like,
Yeah,
just a thought.
and I get it. It depends how you grow up. A lot of people grow up like, if you were a white person adopted into a black family,
Yeah.
that's a part of your culture now. So I
Yeah.
get it. And I'm consciously aware that these
Yeah.
exceptions exist, but as
Yeah.
a whole,
They
you
don't.
end up being so protective over the small things that you have a grasp on that it's
Yeah.
hard to want to let outsiders into that. So yeah, that I think that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So, talking about navigating this one will be fun. Talking about navigating the world of white people as a black person. Another thing that I side eye often, and I try not to do this because I'm sure it's just a loud minority, but
Yeah.
is the Norse pagans because of the common association with white supremacy, neo Nazis, all of that. So, since you have more of a background with like Germany and your
Yeah.
experience with, European mysticism and all of that, tell me your opinion about that.
Okay, so I will preface by saying, after talking to you, specifically bringing like ancestral work to like my mind, I don't do ancestral work, but
Mhm.
from my ancestry, it does very just prevalent Germanic roots. So I am interested in like Eastern European folklore, folk magic. The diversity in that region, I think, is just utterly fascinating. Um, and probably to some people's surprise, white supremacy is very much alive and well, along
Surprise,
with neo
surprise.
yeah, along with neo-Nazism, fascism, the whole bucket exists.
Mhm.
Especially on online spaces, it can get very tricky very quickly. um,
Mhm.
because that community also has an overlap with like goth and punk communities.
Mhm.
And then also with pagan communities, witchcraft communities. And these people are very good at finding themselves very quickly,
Yeah.
which is really disturbing when you think about it.
Mhm.
Um, and I know within those communities, they're consistently coming up with iconography that kind of flies under the radar. So there was a big controversy a while ago of them taking runes and editing runes to like be a symbol. Um,
Mhm.
and it's just really upsetting.
Yeah.
And I know there is a group heavily pushing back on this. There are a lot of people in online spaces dedicated to outing these people.
Yeah.
And I think it's fantastic. And I know specifically within like the witch TikTok spaces. And I was actually surprised that this mostly came from men, but a
Mhm.
lot of white men who are practicing Norse paganism are very aggressive, specifically on TikTok, of like
Mhm.
outing people, reclaiming the space, being like, no, like this isn't acceptable, it's not allowed, and we're not going to tolerate it, which is great. And I
It
desperately
is.
think we need more people like that.
Mhm. And I think it's interesting you brought that up because I think a lot of white men tend to end up in Norse pagan
Yeah.
practices because that's where they see themselves.
Yeah.
It's not to get away from women or get away from
Yeah.
black
Yeah.
people. So when they end up seeing themselves, they see other similarly minded men and they're like,
Yeah.
okay, you kind of have a little solidarity only
Yeah.
to find out that there's like undercover like racism or
Yeah.
misogyny or something. It
Yeah.
can be very disappointing. And just like you said, I saw a lot of that's kind of how it was brought to my attention.
Yeah.
That brought to my attention in the sense that the issue was bigger than I realized.
Yes.
Was on TikTok. A lot of guys that I follow will talk about how they're they're working really hard to reclaim Norse
Yeah.
paganism and like sort of break it from that stigma. I mean, it's still very prevalent. It's hard to get rid of because, like you said, they kind of just create their own little code, and then it's hard to keep up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I
I
know.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so I was gonna say, and they are like, so, like, as a white person, obviously, I know, like, white supremacy exists, but you
Hmm.
don't really realize how prevalent it is until you move into those spaces, and then it's
Yeah,
like, "Oh my gosh, this is terrifying."
yeah,
Um, and then they're just so good at it.
yeah.
And recently a, like, organization that's very much dedicated to world peace, I'm not gonna name drop this time, shared pictures of female Ukrainian troops on International Women's Day, and one of them is wearing a neo-Nazi symbol, that just straight up looks like pagan iconography.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what it was
How did you
until,
find out?
people were calling them out. And so, like,
Oh.
the people who are dedicated to fighting, like, this kind of, subverted language and iconography came forward and
Hmm.
was like, "Yo,
Wow.
neo-Nazi symbol, not okay. That's not a
Yeah,
pagan symbol." Um, and so, yeah, it's mind-blowing that that's what it takes. It takes
yeah.
these group of very dedicated individuals.
I it's very interesting that even in the and I'm not trying to paint all white people as being like racist or horrible or anything like that. So
Yeah,
anybody listening or watching, like that's not what I'm doing. You can whine about it in the email if you want, but I won't listen. So
yeah. I'll delete it
I
for
think
you.
it's very interesting that the black or evil magic is
Yeah,
associated with like the black or brown practices, but then you have these undercover racists and these actual undercover racists in these practices, and they don't get labeled anything.
yeah.
It's just crazy.
Yeah. I think they're really good at stating or, like, giving the presentation that they're not in existence and that they're not
Mhm.
active and that they're not collecting,
Right.
which is just very much against the truth, so,
Right. And I think, people really want to believe like racism isn't a thing
yeah,
anymore or like, misogyny isn't real or something like
Yeah.
that. So since it's not so front and center, it's very easy for them to just put their blinders on
Yeah.
and look away, um, which is frustrating. But
Yeah.
I have to imagine too, I guess this is the one occasion where white men have it hard too.
They do. I feel sorry for them,
I should
like,
edit that
especially
out.
in Norse paganism. I'm like, "You're doing your
Yeah.
best. You're
And
doing
it's
your
really
best."
I've never personally I don't have any Norse or, like, Celtic roots as far as
Yeah.
I'm aware, nothing prevalent enough for me to want to really dive any deeper than just a little bit of the folklore because it's interesting, like, just the
Yeah.
stories are interesting. So I'm similar to you in hoodoo, like, I have an awareness of it,
Yeah.
I know what's going on in the community, but I don't really deeply involve myself because it's not something I feel connected to in any kind of way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess, that's really, that's a lot of heavy topics. So,
Yeah.
I don't think I
Sorry.
really have anything else, uh, other
Yeah.
than those 3 main things. Was there anything else you wanted to follow up on?
No, I think that's it. Other than I would like to encourage people to be better in their lives. And if you have the opportunity to be an ally and help make space to uplift other person's voices, that would be my request.
Oh, I love that. I can't say it any better, so I
Yeah.
guess we can just end it right there. So, listeners or viewers, thank you so much for listening to this
Yeah.
episode about black magic. And, yeah, catch us next time for
Say
more
goodbye,
cats,
Calypso.
more cats. Next time, catch us in our next episode. We're going to be talking about karma and free will and all of that fun stuff. And if you want, make sure to follow us on YouTube. Otherwise, you can email us if you have any questions. If you have concerns, keep them to yourself. I'm kidding. But yeah, thank you guys for watching or listening to Whining with the Witches. Bye.
Bye.